Hello and welcome to WTCW's Department Number 2 podcast. We are on part 2 on our discussion with Dan Masters on the Battle of Stones River and the Stones River campaign. Previously, we talked a little bit about the historiography of the battle and campaign, talked a lot about Braxton Bragg, and a little bit about General Rosecrans as well. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about the actual fighting itself, what happened on December 31st, January 1st, and January 2nd. They're at the end of 1862 and into 1863. A little bit of date changes there that can be hard to follow with the year changes. So, Daryl, what we got going on?
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to part 2. We're so blessed, and we'll probably run 3 parts. We have so much to talk about with Stones River, but we're blessed. It's very cool to have Dan Masters on board with us. Dan has got a forthcoming book on the Battle of Stones River. Actually, it's going to be 2 books, but right? Because the second book's going to have massive casualty lists listed.
Yes, it will.
So we're really looking forward to this 2-part series that it's coming out on the Battle of Stones River. But hopefully most of you that are listening or hearing this podcast, you know Dan through his blog, as well as some of the books that he has published, mostly self-published up to this point, if I remember correctly. But you know, this forthcoming Stones River dual volume is actually going to come through our friends at Savas Beatty. And so we're really looking forward to that. We're just looking forward to Stones River, period. I've known Dan online, I don't know, a few years now. Obviously, I follow the blog. I borrow information from Dan on occasion. He has been gracious in the past. He has shared his note, maybe it is supposed to be a pun intended, but his master list of some of the articles. And I've actually used some of those myself for some of the blog posts that we've had on the Western Theater and Civil War website. But I've known Dan on and off, but finally got to meet him face to face. Well, I guess it was a couple of years ago. We were down at Richmond.
Yeah,
I think that's the first time we got to meet and enjoyed that. And even that conversation there, we're standing there behind one of the modern churches, and we're talking about artillery range. And we started talking about the ranges, I think, of 6-pounder howitzers or 6-pounder guns, sorry, for the Confederates. And we're going, yeah, they just can't reach there from here, right? And I think that's what we came to, which is a blog post I've been working on forever and ever. Anyway, again, just great to have Dan here. If you haven't gone to his blog, you need to do it. He's a prolific writer, probably posting usually something every day, probably averaging.
If not new content, we're up at this point. I think we're on blog post number 812.
Oh my God!
So there are some things that are reshared, but I aim to try to publish something 2 to 3 times a week. Really, for me, it's more you just come across so much great stuff, and I love sharing it. I love getting it out there, and in a way, it's my own way of taking notes for my own writing projects in the future. It's like, oh, I've already written this out. I can go grab it off the blog, and it's. I take a lot of enjoyment. It kind of like Will Griffin with Spared and Shared. I just love getting this stuff out there, and I love it when I hear from other people that are using it, further their own research and do their own writings. That's why I've done it. I wanted to get it out there and kind of extract it out of these newspapers and these obscure books that kind of hard to find, and get it out there for the community to help us better understand what happened. I mean, that's really why we're here. We're trying to better understand this conflict and understand how this catastrophe in the 19th century shaped our character. We were all born in the 20th century, but how is that shaping the 21st century as well? So,
absolutely. Sounds great. Well, I mean, you kind of just segued right into it. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dan, just to give us a little bit of background again about yourself, but talk a little bit about the forthcoming book, and then I think Derek wants to tie in a couple things, and then we'll start hitting the questions.
Okay. So, as far as myself, 47 years old, work for a metals manufacturer as a supplier relationship manager. So I work within the supply chain space. I've been in supply chain now for 20 plus years, been in manufacturing pushing 30, which is kind of scary. But have a deep love for the Civil War. It's grown out of, really out of a genealogy project, realizing that my family had served almost exclusively in the Army of the Cumberland. So this particular army really has a deep connection for me. And studying the Western theater it really been my focus for most of the last 20 years. So during that time, I've written, I'm on book number 10 or 11. I've lost count. I'm somewhere in that area code. A lot of focus on Ohio troops, starting to expand a little more. The Stones River book's really the first one we're kind of breaking out of the just the pure Ohio mold. Larry Strayer and I have been working on a trilogy about Ohio in the Civil War, which volume 2 will be coming out within the next 60 days or so, which we're very excited about because it covers that really fraught middle period of the war: Fredericksburg, Stones River, Vicksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Chickamauga. I mean, it all happened within about a span of a year, and that's what this volume's focused on.
And volume 1's great for anybody that's wondering. I loved volume 1.
Oh, thank you. The Stones River book, Hell by the Acre, which is being published by Savas Spady, will be coming out later this summer. I'm thinking the August time frame is about the closest what we have at this point. But you're very excited about that, and really kind of how it differs from previous books is very much built from the ground up, from really the soldier's point of view about this battle, with a lot of focus on accounts from men in the ranks and tying it all into a narrative such that battles are it's chaotic, and we're sometimes as historians, I think we try to put too much construction around what is really completely unconstructible. It's really chaos unleashed, and the men themselves, as as they look back on this event, even just a few days later, they readily admit that they struggle in their words to explain what happened here at the end of 1862. Battle of Stones River occurred, the primary fighting occurred on December 31st, with another brief interlude of very heavy combat on the evening of January 2nd. But the campaign really started on December 26th, when the Army of the Cumberland left Nashville and started marching south towards Murfreesboro. There was conflict on the 26th, the 27th, the 29th, some pretty heavy conflict on the 30th, and then, of course, the main fighting on the 31st. Two armies, the Army of the Cumberland on the Union side, the Army of Tennessee on the Confederate side, clashed here at Murfreesboro. When the smoke cleared several days later, the armies had inflicted 25,000 plus casualties on one another. Basically, one man out of three that went into this engagement was either killed, wounded, or captured, making it a little more bloody even than Shiloh, which is quite a sobering achievement. But that said, at the end of the battle, the Union Army still held the field, although they had taken quite a walloping on the 31st, lost a lot of casualties, a lot of men captured, a lot of guns captured. But at the end of the day, they provided a critical victory to the Union cause at a time when the Union fortunes were really kind of, they were really down on their luck. I mean, we had the Emancipation Proclamation taking effect on January 1st. It's kind of an interesting what if the Union Army had failed here too, like they had it at Fredericksburg and Chickasaw Bayou? How does that change the complexion of the war? So for that reasons, among many others, I think the Battle of Stones River is a fascinating conflict to study, not just from the tactical perspective, but also understanding its meaning in the greater context of the war.
Absolutely. Well, it's one of those battles. I've had this conversation with our mutual friend Andy Papin from Missouri. It's one of those battles that we really want to get into, but it's also very difficult because of the lack of ground that has been preserved.
Right.
And I think Ranger Jim Lewis made a comment to me once that it's less than 20% of the core battlefield is actually in a state of preservation, even with some of the efforts that have been made over the last few years. American Battlefield Trust, there's been some properties that have been preserved, but some of that, all the initial fighting, right? All that area.
Yeah, really the first 3 hours of the battle is all now been, with a few very minor exceptions, has largely been lost to development, such that it's very difficult to explain the flow of the battle on the ground itself. I mean, well, we're going to go to this parking lot over here of this car dealership, and the battle really started over here at this apartment complex behind the dumpsters. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, Murfreesboro is a rapidly growing city, as Nashville itself is a extremely popular area for folks to move into. But yes, it does present some interpretation challenges. Now, fortunately, the land that the national park has preserved is of some of the most crucial fighting of the battle. Of course, at the Round Forest, some of the ground in the Cedars. There's, I think, some more room that could be done with the interpretation of the ground that we do have. And I think some of the maps and things that we have coming out with the Stones River book will kind of open people's eyes to, you hear about, the Mississippi, the Mississippi half acre and whatnot. I don't think there was just one. There was the one up by the Round Forest where Chalmers Brigade was chopped up pretty badly. There was an even worse one down in the southern end of the park property where McFadden Lane and Wilkinson Pike meet, where Anderson's Mississippians took horrendous casualties. And you don't see a lot of interpretation done out that far south in the battlefield. So I think that we're reopening some doors to really what that ground can offer. You just need to stand on the ground and tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Dan, without going too deep, but Rosecrans leaves Nashville. Let's talk about the run-up, the immediate run-up right up to Stones River. And then I think we'll delve into some of our specific questions.
So Rosecrans' army leaves on Friday, December 26, 1862. His army consists of what amounts to 3 corps. The right wing under General Alexander McDowell McCook, the center corps of 2 divisions under George Thomas, the left wing under Thomas L. Crittenden, 3 divisions there. So a total of 8 divisions, and then some associated cavalry. The armies marched from Nashville on 3 roads. The center corps basically follows the right wing going towards Nolensville, whereas Crittenden's corps marches straight down the Nashville Pike going directly towards Murfreesboro. Rosecrans was unsure how Bragg was going to react. Initially, what he hoped would happen was that Bragg would sortie out of Murfreesboro and engage him on the Nashville Pike near Stewart's Creek, which is 10 or so miles northeast of Murfreesboro. The idea was that Crittenden would be on the high ground on the north side of Stewart's Creek along Nashville Pike. Bragg would attempt to assault him, which would open up Bragg's left rear to McCook and Thomas, basically coming on parallel roads to get between him and Murfreesboro, and then he would have to, he'd have to leave. The idea was to get him out of the area. By McCook and Thomas moving that direction, they would cut his railroad communication, really seize his base of supplies. That's what Rosecrans hoped would happen. It takes several days for the army to make the march. The Confederate cavalry under Joe Wheeler and John Wharton fight, in my opinion, magnificent delaying action. They hold the Federals up. There's some fighting at Laverne on the 26th and 27th on the Nashville Pike. There's a little more significant conflict at Nolensville and Knob Gap on the 26th. Pretty nasty little squabble at Triune on the 27th. One of the interesting things is the first 2 days of the campaign, it basically rained the whole time. It was miserable weather. And the first day that the skies cleared is Sunday the 28th, and the Federal Army really doesn't go anywhere. And it turns out, and this is something I found after I wrote the book, but I remember, it's like, what, you're 2/3 way to Murfreesboro. Why are you stopping? You now have clear weather, And there was a directive issued by President Lincoln in November asking or directing the Union Army commanders to not engage in military activities unless absolutely necessary on the Sabbath. And I found this in a as a War Department general directive. So the historiographies kind of put this out as well. This is, some of Rosecrans' religious scruples that he didn't want to, kind of like Jackson, he didn't want to fight on a Sunday. Well, that was actually official War Department policy that he was following. But that said, the Army's Stuart's Crittenden's corps basically moves into Murfreesboro late on the 29th. McCook, Thomas's division had actually split into two. Rousseau's division was kind of separate from Negley, but they arrive on the 29th as well. McCook kind of forces his way into position on the 30th. So by the evening of the 30th, the Federal Army's in about a 3-mile line facing Murfreesboro. The Confederate Army of two corps, William J. Hardee on the Confederate left, and Leonidas Polk more in the Confederate center, with John C. Breckinridge's division of Hardee's corps on the Confederate right, with Stones River running between some of their positions. So, I mean, Bragg's position is kind of an odd one, and then he has troops on both sides of the river. But it really kind of sets the stage for this horrendous fight that happens on December 30th, 1862. But that said, Bragg had elected to gather his army at Murfreesboro and basically accept battle as Rosecrans gave it, except that while McCook's corps is moving into position on the Federal right on the 30th, Bragg's kind of surveying what's going on the field. And I think he's come to the conclusion that if he sits back and let Rosecrans do what he thinks Rosie's going to do, he's going to be really hard pressed to hold his ground. Whereas if he surprises Rosecrans with a dawn assault, he might be able to knock him off kilter enough to drive the Federals away from Murfreesboro. And that's really kind of what happens on the morning.
Excellent. Thanks for that synopsis. Derek, did you want to interject anything here?
Yeah.
So dig in?
Yeah, so just real quick before we move on to some other questions, this one just kind of popped up while listening. On the 31st, on that morning, what is Bragg's, is his objective just to get Rosecrans to leave, or is his objective to totally just smash up Rosecrans' army?
Well, his tactical concept, I think, was a sound one. He stacked a couple of his divisions. There's a total of about 13,000 men on his right, including Wharton's cavalry brigade. So it amounts to more than a third of the army. He knew that McCook's corps was pretty well stretched out. I mean, it was stretched out 1.5 miles to 2 miles in line, which for a corps of about 15,000 men, they're places where they're a little thin. And the thought was, well, if we can overwhelm this corps, we can overwhelm Rosecrans's right, we might be able to fold the Union line back up such that we can trap them in the bends of Stones River between the railroad and Stones River. Mm-hmm. There are fords along Stones River that Rosecrans could have utilized to move northward. The problem is that would put Rosecrans on the eastern bank of Stones River, whereas the road to Nashville, his supply base, is on the western bank of Stones River. So Bragg would now be athwart Rosecrans' supply line and actually between Rosecrans and his supply base. So it was really a way to try to turn the tables on Rosecrans. And for all intents and purposes, it came within a whisker of working. Mm-hmm. The Federal Army was ultimately driven all the way back to the Nashville Pike. And really what saved the Federal Army, and as I explain in the book, I call it the miracle at the 3-mile marker, is Cleburne's division is moving in. This is 2:30 in the afternoon, driving towards the Nashville Pike. And McCown's division had just charged against the Pioneer Brigade in a massive, I think up to 50 Federal cannon arrayed along the Nashville Pike at different places that took McCown's men under fire. McCown's men make this attack. Ector's Texans in particular get pretty close, but they're repulsed. and the right brigade of Cleburne's division kind of catches this panic, and it spreads throughout the division. And almost as quick as you could tell it, 3 of the 4 brigades are racing away from Nashville Pike. And by the time when Cleburne gets them stopped, it's well after 3, and they're looking around like, what in the world just happened? Mm-hmm. Well, they had been countercharged by a couple of Union regiments, but really this panic, they say there's 2 things that are contagious on a battlefield, courage and cowardice. And when a panic starts, as it did here, and Cleburne's division was these were some of the best fighters in the Army of the Tennessee, but once that panic started, they couldn't stop it, right. And they were really kind of dumbfounded as to why exactly this happened. They're kind of looking around like, well, I retreated because you did, and I retreated because you did. They keep looking off to the right, and really what happened, my personal opinion was the brigade that there were several brigades that got very close to this heavy concentration of Union artillery pieces that basically took them all under fire, and they saw there was no way they were gonna be able to cross that pike. Right. And I think what started off as a orderly retreat turned into a panic. Mm-hmm. But the concentration of Union artillery is what saved the Army of the Cumberland at that moment.
Seems like that'll happen.
Yeah.
Artillery is
doesn't it?
Yeah. So
and just to be clear, there was a total of 1 Confederate artillery battery in action on that part of the field. They were The reason being is they had advanced through the cedars, and if you've ever been to Stones River and gone through those grounds, you're really going to struggle to get any kind of wheeled traffic through there. And artillery pieces, I mean, there were Federal artillery units, particularly those attached to Rousseau's division, that they didn't follow their brigades into the forest because there was no way to get them in. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden they saw there's no way to get them out. Well, likewise, as the Confederate infantry has passed over the cedars, their supporting artillery can't follow them. Mm-hmm. So you end up having a pure infantry on entrenched artillery fight later that afternoon, and it doesn't. It goes as you would expect it to go.
Yeah.
And really, Federal morale by that point had recovered, and it's quite. As I call that the miracle at the 3-mile marker for good reason.
So one thing I want to ask too is, at a lot of these major battles, you have these units or commanders that become very well known because of the battle, or they do something that's just considered extraordinary and it just gets attached to them. There's a lot of examples. Daryl, do I do it? Do I bring up that place, that little college town?
That insignificant engagement in July of 1863?
Yeah. You know how...
We want to talk about Chad's Pet, right?
Yeah, that's right. July 4th. Very important battle.
Yeah.
That sets the tone for the entire great raid of 1863.
Exactly.
The entire rest of the war.
Yeah, the entire rest of the war.
So, you've got these units, you got these men that I don't, they've become famous because of this battle. At Stones River, what are the Union or Confederate units or commanders that seem to just perform exceptionally well, that deserve to be recognized for that?
Mm-hmm. And this is just purely my personal opinion. Certainly the generals who came out of that battle with enhanced reputations was Rosecrans himself, who repeatedly demonstrated utter fearlessness on the battlefield. And of course, he came off as a victor yet again. As sloppy as a victory as it may have been, it was a victory. He came off the field with a little more of a shine on him. Phil Sheridan certainly did. Phil Sheridan's division fought a tremendous delaying action south of the Wilkinson Pike, took 40% casualties in so doing. Part of that miracle at the 3-mile marker was done by 2 regiments of George Roberts' brigade of Sheridan's division, the 27th and 51st Illinois regiments. They certainly came out with a bit of a shine on them. Hazen William Babcock Hazen fighting at the Round Forest certainly came out with quite an enhanced reputation, as did I'd say 3 of his 4 regiments, the 6th Indiana, or the 9th Indiana, 41st Ohio, and 6th Kentucky. The 110th Illinois was kind of the problem child of that brigade and didn't quite get the shine. But they came out with an enhanced reputation. In my personal opinion, John Franklin Miller, who was a Union brigade commander in Negley's division, came out, I think delivered the best overall performance, in particular for his counterattack on the evening of January 2nd, which was done without orders and without sanction, and did a great deal to recover the grounds that had been lost when Sam Beatty's division was overrun at the beginning of Breckinridge's attack. So I think on the Union side, those are the ones that kind of come out of this fight, as I said, with an enhanced reputation. Mm-hmm. On the Confederate side, it's important to remember most of the Confederate infantrymen and most of the Confederate Army felt that they had won this battle. When they left on January 3rd, they were convinced that they had given better than they got during the battle, and all of them felt like they had done their duty. The ones really, when you think about the Confederate commanders, I don't know that any of them really come out with an enhanced reputation after this, because the Army so quickly devolved into this infighting about Bragg's, whether he had lost the confidence of the Army. There was a number of brigade commanders, St. John Liddell, it probably, to me, delivered the best overall performance of the battle. I mean, basically just very hard charging brigade commander. His memoir is fantastic. Such an eye-opening view to the command dysfunction in the Army of Tennessee, but he was a gifted combat leader. He was one of the better ones, and his brigade was Arkansans, I think 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th Arkansas. They did quite well. A personal favorite for me is General Daniel Adams, who had a Louisiana brigade. It was the 13th, 20th, 16th, 25th, and the 41st Alabama. Probably staged the most impressive attack on the Round Forest that came the closest of any of them to breaking the Union hold there. That was, I think, the third assault on the Round Forest. So I think, but they suffered heavily for that too. Other regiments that really kind of stand out, the 8th Tennessee, that lost 306 men during the battle, the highest number on the Confederate side. Patton Anderson's Mississippians took unbelievable casualties on a very small piece of ground. I think one regiment lost 63 killed and 139 wounded in the space of about 20 minutes. God. I mean, we're talking like Cold Harbor figures here.
Yeah.
And that, to me, the reputation of the Confederate infantryman as a fighting man certainly was enhanced by the Battle of Stones River. Even though it was, ultimately an unsuccessful engagement for them. But my God, the courage that these men showed, some of the charges that they had to make against Federal positions at the Round Forest, along the Nashville Pike, in the Cedars themselves. I mean, their formations would get shot to tatters, and they keep going anyway. I mean, you might not agree with their cause, but you gotta admire their courage.
Yeah. Yeah, just that ability to have a whole blasted in the line, and then they dress it up and keep going. That's That's pretty amazing to be able to keep doing that while under fire.
I don't know. I don't know how they did it, but they're in the Union soldiers that saw it were not shy about sharing that admiration as well. Once again, I mean, this is their mortal enemies, but they're Americans fighting Americans, and at a deeper level, this is, I think, is horrific as the fighting is. Long term, it sets the stage for how we can reconcile. There's a respect that's growing between these two parties out of these type of conflicts. They started off the war thinking, well, one Yankee or one Southerner will beat 10 of these Yankee hirelings, and then Northerners had that same opinion. And these battles at like Shiloh and Perryville and Stones River kind of wipe away this early war dismissive attitude they had about the courage of their opponents. You get to the middle of the war, they realize that was a bunch of bunk, and that the men were fighting are pretty tough. And it sets the war only gets bloodier after Stones River, unfortunately. You look at Chickamauga, the bloodiest battle of the Western Theater. The armies are veteranizing. These engagements veteranize the armies, and they become more proficient killing machines. I mean, it's really what an army is. It's an animal of consumption and destruction. That's essentially why it exists. And both armies are become quite expert after Stones River at hurting their enemy. But I think that core of respect for the other side starts to take a deeper root. And long term, we're talking years in the future, it does allow for some measure of reconciliation between the two sides, which was absolutely essential for the country to move forward.
Right. So, Dan, earlier you talked about Rosecrans being that guy that is in the fighting. He's up close to the lines. A lot of soldiers seem to have seen him during the battle. He is making himself seen. Unlike Bragg, seems not quite visible on the Confederate side. It seems like he just kind of stays at his headquarters. Is that a good way to?
Well, I'm going to challenge that a little bit. Up until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the battle was going Bragg's way. What value would there be in him being up front?
Right.
The men were getting the job done. They don't need him up there, getting them all razzed up. They're getting the job done. So, and conversely, on the Union side, Rosecrans was widely seen because his army was on the cusp of collapse.
Yeah.
Let's be very honest. When the right wing collapsed, it was a very dire situation. Most of the accounts that I've read of where Rosecrans is seen are by Harker's Brigade, which is part of Van Cleve's. Really, Van Cleve's division, which is deployed on Asbury Lane, just north of the current park property, in a desperate attempt to salvage the right. Rosecrans himself directs what is ultimately a failed counterattack by Fife's Brigade that almost gets Fife's Brigade captured.
Yeah.
People forget that part of it. They remember Rosecrans being up front and directing this counterattack, but when it went sour, they don't remember him being around for that.
Right. So he's up there out of necessity, and is he getting, I guess, a word they might have used back then, excitable? Where he's most soldiers' accounts said he was calm, unflappable, totally inspirational. Despite the problems with Fife's counterattack, the general impression the soldiers admired the fact that their army commander was right up there in the front lines with them, and that just solidifies this love that they have for Rosecrans. Some of the more thoughtful soldiers might be thinking, this probably really isn't the proper place for the army commander to be. But on the one level, they admired it. And on the other level, it was like, well, this is prototypical Rosecrans. This is how he fights his battles. This is how he was at Corinth. This is how he was in West Virginia in 1861. This is how the man rolls. And but in this case, he had to. And it was very dangerous. By 11 or 11:30, when this Fife counterattack took place, Rosecrans already had blood on his overcoat that had been splattered when an aide who was riding at his side was gunned down. It would not be very long after this, in the early hours of the afternoon, as Rosecrans was riding towards the Round Forest. You can go to that where this event occurred if you're at the National Cemetery. On the southern edge of the cemetery, there's the stone wall, and then there's an open field between there and the Round Forest. Well, as Rosecrans was riding over this ground with his staff and with Julius Garishay riding within inches of him, Garishay was decapitated. Yeah. As they were riding at full steam going towards the Round Forest.
a very interesting what if scenario. What if that cannonball was 6 inches the other direction,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't Garachet who was decapitated, but it was Rosecrans. He was that close.
So
it very well could have been him.
When Garachet got hit, where did that artillery shell come from?
Wayne's Hill.
Wayne's Hill. And would that
Across
be one of was that
probably the 5th
Cobb's
Company
battery?
Washington Light
Washington
Artillery.
Okay. All right.
Probably. It was a long range shot, but my God, was it a shot?
And what alerted them to that position to fire on that spot?
Oh, they could see clearly from their position atop Wayne's Hill that there was a cavalcade of horsemen,
mm-hmm.
and they knew that they were aware there wasn't a lot of Union cavalry in this battle at all, and
mm-hmm.
what there were was far to the rear. So they saw that, and they hit. I mean, these guys have been in the Army for a while now. They knew when a general is moving around on the battlefield, he's got an escort, he's got a staff, and it's a known entity. So they
mm-hmm.
saw, all they knew is it was a general in his staff, and they took a pot shot at it.
mm-hmm.
And it was a 1 in a million shot. But as I said, they came within a whisker of decapitating the commander of the Army of the Cumberland. Now that really kind of begs the question, this happens about 1:30 in the afternoon. What's that do to the Army for the rest of the battle? Now you don't have Rosecrans in charge. You're going to have, my guess is George Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very interesting, once again, it didn't happen, but it came very good. And that was the second time on the 31st that Rosecrans had been nearly killed. But yeah, he is up close now. As far as Braxton Bragg, he was not absent from the battlefield at all. He followed the progress very closely from his headquarters near Nashville Pike. I think down near a little beyond the 2-mile marker. If you know where the Cowan House is, there is the Bragg headquarters marker a little further down on Nashville Pike, kind of in that vicinity.
Dog park, isn't it?
Yeah. And how appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
On the afternoon of the 31st, before Dan Adams' brigade goes into their assault on the Round Forest, Bragg does make an appearance and actually makes an impassioned appeal to his fellow Louisianans that encouraging them in this attack they're about to. I mean, there's an account from Captain John Ellis, a remarkable account about Bragg's speech.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that that's made it into many other accounts of the battle, but he was not absent from the battlefield. But generally, the need for him to be up front, stirring up the men, it wasn't needed.
Right.
But for this attack that Adams made in the afternoon, he was certainly there, and he certainly oversaw it and oversaw the destruction of that brigade. Which had been very discouraging for him.
Yeah, and I think what you just said about Bragg ties in really well with what we talked about last episode in the first part with the bad rap that Bragg has received really since the war. But I want to jump back to
Mm-hmm.
Garachet and Rosecrans just real quick, just because that story has, I mean, it's one that is, you can't help but think about it a little bit. This good friend of Rosecrans just has his head removed right next to Rosecrans.
This is his muse.
Yeah.
This is his essentially a brother.
So how does that affect? I've always been curious about how does that affect Rosecrans for the rest of the battle when you see someone that close to you, head get removed and the blood, I assume, gets on Rosecrans.
His immediate reaction was pretty much, well, brave men are killed in battle, and he goes on about his business.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that it's a shock reaction. I'm just thinking, any of us, you've ever been in a car accident, what your immediate reaction is. I mean, if you're in the accident, you're glad you're not, missing an arm or something, and you kind of go on and do what you need to do. I think where the impact for Rosecrans it's not really felt until later on. I don't know that he emotionally allowed himself to feel that loss. I mean, he had too much on his plate at the moment.
Yeah.
He's got thousands of men whose lives are just as valuable as Garachet's, who'd been lost already. I mean, his army was on the ropes at that point. So it doesn't, interestingly, it doesn't impact anything he does immediately.
Mm-hmm.
How it comes into play is a little later on that night. Kind of moving the story forward a little bit, the Union Army does hold their position around Nashville Pike. They hold their position at Round Forest, and by the end of the day, they do have a secure supply line to Nashville. But the Army's been folded up almost like a jackknife. They're now all very concentrated, but their offensive options are rather limited. And there's a commanders conference late that evening, and there's divided counsel about what to do. McCook is recommending that the Army retreat. George Thomas kind of famously says, if he wakes up out of, gets stirred from sleep, this Army doesn't retreat. And Crittenden's kind of, as one would expect out of Crittenden, who's kind of a non-entity in a command situation, really doesn't have an opinion. So Rosecrans ends up taking a midnight ride with another close friend, David Stanley, another fellow Catholic. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of a key thing here. These gentlemen ride north on the Nashville Pike towards, they cross Overalls Creek, and they're heading towards Stewart Creek, which is several miles in the rear, basically kind of scoping out potential places for the Army to fall back to, looking for good ground. Now, neither Stanley nor Rosecrans have, to my knowledge, ever discussed what they discussed during that 2-hour ride. But somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m., Rosecrans came to the conclusion that he was going to stand his ground and stay there. My sense is that had Garishay been alive, Garishay would have been the one making that ride with Rosecrans, not Stanley. Mm-hmm. But this was a crisis moment for the Army. I mean, they one could argue the Union Army was defeated on December 31st. They'd lost about 3 miles of ground. They lost 3,500 prisoners, 29 cannon, a half dozen flags, and it had really taken a walloping. Mm-hmm. That was not how this was supposed to go. And I think Rosecrans needed somebody he could trust. And, like I said, he was a very devout Catholic. That was his world. Mm-hmm. And I think he needed a fellow Catholic to, let's say, commiserate with, but maybe needed some spiritual guidance. Father Tracy was there, but he did not go on this ride. Normally that'd be who he would talk to. But I suspect that this was, call it a coming to Jesus moment for Rosecrans. And Stanley filled that void that Garishay would have filled otherwise. Mm-hmm. I don't know what Garishay would have recommended, whether the Army stay or fly. I mean, unfortunately, we're never going to know. But I know Rosecrans trusted him implicitly, and his loss was really to the Army's detriment in future days.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that story is just kind of haunted in a way, I guess, with the thought that your closest friend just is there, and then next second the head's gone, and you've got to command an army in the meantime.
You have no time to grieve.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
You do not. He might have grieved privately. The Rosecrans he didn't sleep much, which was part of the problem. Garishay was a little better at making sure Rosecrans took care of his physical well-being, making sure he got enough sleep. Garfield, I think he just let Rosie do whatever Rosie was going to do, and he worked as at Chickamauga, pretty much worked himself to a frazzle such that by September 20th, he was in not a very good mental state. And I think if Garishay was there, Rosecrans would have been better rested, because Garishay would have insisted on it, and Rosecrans would have listened.
Yeah.
But he had no time to grieve. He didn't have time to grieve this. He had too many responsibilities on it, the burden of command. Mm-hmm. And but despite that personal loss, he stayed on task.
Yeah.
He had the mental toughness to stay on task, and I wouldn't say it didn't rattle him, at least not with his performance on the field. He might have been internally very distraught, but it didn't show. Maybe it showed a couple of weeks later, but.
Well, you mentioned the lack of the mounted arm. Every Memorial Day weekend, I lead a tour at a cemetery north of Cincinnati, and buried there is one Colonel John Minor Milliken of the 1st Ohio Cavalry. there's not a lot of cavalry actions going on. And there's some.
Interesting fact. My third great grandfather was with Milliken when they made that charge. He was in Company H, the 1st Ohio Cavalry.
Yeah, when they get cut off, surrounded. Yeah. So, but talk about what are the Mounted Arms doing for both sides during this?
Okay.
Let's talk about through the period of the 31st through the 2nd.
Sure. So we talked a bit about how on the Confederate side, Wheeler's brigade and John Wharton's brigade. Wheeler's brigade operated primarily along the Nashville Pike. Wharton's brigade more on the left of the army out towards Nolensville and Trioune and whatnot. But they had served essentially in fighting delaying actions on the run up to the battle itself. On December 30th, as the Confederate Army is now concentrated at Murfreesboro, Joseph Wheeler's brigade is directed to ride around Rosecrans' army and cut his supply routes, basically cut the Nashville Pike. Wheeler rides out on the 30th. He gets into a pretty good scrap with John Starkweather's brigade, who you may remember from Perryville. Gets into a fight with them at Jefferson Pike. Rides over to Laverne and mixes into the Union wagons there and manages to capture Alexander McCook's command wagon, along with General McCook's rather large uniform, which they take back as a prize to Murfreesboro, and his personal papers, which are later the salacious details of which are published in the one of the Mobile daily newspapers. But they essentially ride around the Union Army, disrupting wagon traffic and whatnot, just generally raising a ruckus. So that's Wheeler's brigade makes that circuit. Wharton's brigade is kept with the army and is put on the far left beyond McCown's division. And as McCown hits Johnson's division on the morning of the 31st, Wharton's brigade is riding beyond him towards what's called Puckett Creek, which turns into Overalls Creek, basically kind of sweeping and capturing Union troops by the bushel. So they're used, basically as almost like a raiding force. And then they also charge, McCook's ordnance wagons, which is where Colonel Milliken is killed. The 1st Ohio Cavalry makes a hell-bent for leather cavalry charge that comes close to succeeding until it doesn't. And they ended up falling back. So that's how Wharton's engaged on the 31st. There's also a very small brigade under John Pegram, which I think has 2 regiments. They're on the far Confederate right. They really don't do much other than patrol for most of the battle. And there's another remnant of the Kentucky campaign, a small brigade of 3 regiments under General Buford that takes place. They take part in some minor fighting on the 31st at the end of the day, but by and large aren't a major component in the battle. Wheeler's brigade attempts to make another circuit around the Union Army on January 1st, but they get roughed up pretty badly at Laverne, fighting with the 1st Michigan Cavalry and 1st Michigan Engineers and mechanics, and end up being so roughed up from that engagement that they pretty much don't do much else the rest of the battle except provide Bragg with some faulty intelligence. On the Union side, there was only a couple of brigades of cavalry. There was Robert Minty's brigade, which basically followed Crittenden's corps. There was Lewis Som's brigade, 1st, 3rd, and 4th Ohio Cavalries that operated really with Thomas's corps and with the far right wing. And then there was the reserve cavalry, which included the notorious Anderson troop of Pennsylvanians, most of whom mutinied on December 26th and refused to march out of Nashville, and along with 2 very recently raised Tennessee cavalry regiments that were as green as gourds and wild and undisciplined. And that was your Union cavalry force at Stones River. It was rather small. Minty's brigade, I think, was the crack brigade in that particular arm, and that showed on several times. But by and large, I think one key takeaway, certainly a key takeaway for Rosecrans, he does not have enough cavalry to effectively move an enemy country. That is abundantly obvious. It comes up multiple times during the campaign that he's sending infantry out to do a job that the cavalry should be doing, but there's no cavalry to do it. Bragg runs into the same problem. You got to think his largest cavalry division, which is under Morgan, about 3,900 troopers, is moving off towards Kentucky. They're out of the campaign. Another 1,000 or 1,200 or so under Forrest are raiding in western Tennessee. You start to wonder, well, if Bragg had those 5,000 cavalrymen with him at Stones River, I wonder that would have had a more pronounced impact on the outcome of the battle than Carter Stevenson's infantry division, just because of the problems they could have caused in Rosecrans's rear. With a cavalry force that large, that puts a different spin on things. But then again, if they were still there, Rosecrans may not have ever sortied from Nashville in the first place. But yeah, they were both the cavalry arm of both armies was extremely busy during this campaign. There wasn't a whole lot, other than the fighting there along Asbury Road on December 31st with Zom's brigade and Wharton. By and large, you didn't have a lot of cavalry on cavalry actions during the battle. It was largely, the Confederates used their cavalry to either interdict Union supply lines or to gather up prisoners. The Union Army basically tried to use their cavalry to protect their wagon trains. But yeah, there's just, and as you'll see in 1863, a much greater emphasis in the Union Army on developing the mounted army. And you start getting things like the Wilder's Lightning Brigade.
Yeah.
Rosecrans had plenty of infantry. He had infantry to spare, such that he was willing to offer these guys up to be mounted, because he kept requesting more cavalry, and they're hard to get. So he's like, okay, well, if you can't give me cavalry, give me mules, and I'll put my infantrymen on them, and we'll make a go of it. And it turned out to work pretty well.
So, Dan, I think this is where we get to one of those topics that I don't know if infamous is the right word, but as a Kentuckian, this event on January 2nd is one of those that has, in a way, helped immortalize the Kentucky Orphan Brigade, or 1st Kentucky Brigade, however people want to say it. What happens on January 2nd, and why the story is, which is obviously not correct, but the story is the Kentuckians are just basically sheep led to the slaughter, and that's the end of the story.
And that's a really awful thing to say about these Kentucky troops, which were phenomenal fighters. It takes a bit of explanation to understand how that story came to be. We have to go back to December 26th. On December 26th, the Union Army was just starting to move out of Murfreesboro, but things were proceeding just like normal in the Confederate Army of Tennessee, as in the day after Christmas was the day we execute people. And Asa Lewis of the 6th Kentucky Infantry had deserted, basically gone on French leave to go back home and take care of it, try to set something up, take care of his family.
He'd done that a couple times too, if I recall.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. This wasn't the first time.
Yeah.
And it is captured by what amounts to a bounty hunter, not the Mandalorian or Boba Fett that we're thinking of being on my Star Wars thing here lately. But he's captured by a bounty hunter and turned in and is sentenced to be executed. But there was also a civilian who was executed first that morning, a spy. There was a gentleman in the 28th Alabama who was executed as well. And there's a very poignant letter that he writes to his wife and children the morning he's executed that's in the archives at Stones River. And then there was another gentleman in the 24th Tennessee who at the last moment is given a reprieve by Bragg. But Asa Lewis was not. And we had to understand a bit, the Kentuckians were part of the Confederate Army and part of the Confederacy, but they didn't feel themselves really a part, such as the Conscription Act, which was an act the Confederate Congress passed basically to press men into the service. They did not feel that it applied to Kentucky, but during the Kentucky campaign, Bragg had in some cases invoked the Conscription Act to pull men into service. The other part of the Conscription Act was that it changed the soldier's term of service from 1 year, which almost all of them enlisted for 1 year, into 3 years, basic compulsory service until the war was over. Mm-hmm. Well, these Kentuckians didn't count out of that too well either. So you've got Bragg, invoking this law that they disagree with themselves. I mean, the Kentucky Brigade had some discipline issues. They had at one point nearly mutinied about this issue during the summer of '62. Mm-hmm. And now here we get to the end of the year, and one of their own is scheduled to be executed for essentially exercising the rights that they all felt they should have. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they felt that, hey, we served our 1 year. We should have the right to go home and choose to reenlist if we want. And that Confederate Army is like, well, you're either part of us or you're not, and this is the law of the land. So that's really kind of where the conflict comes. Well, this Asa Lewis execution really became kind of a cause célèbre within the Orphan Brigade, and it really stirred up a lot of nasty passions amongst the men, which you can understand. They're very passionate about these issues. It goes all the way up to Breckinridge going to Bragg on at least 2 occasions, on Christmas Day and then again on the morning of the 26th, begging him to not execute this man. And Bragg's like, no, we're going to carry this execution out. Breckinridge himself was so overwrought that when his brigade had to be there to witness the execution. He nearly fainted and fell out of his saddle. He was just completely overwrought about this event. And now we spring forward a few days. And on December 31st, the Orphan Brigade really, other than some very minor skirmishing along Stones River, they're kind of fat and happy up on Wayne's Hill. Really don't take a major part in the battle. The other 3 brigades of Breckinridge's divisions certainly take an important part of the battle. Adams' brigade, as I had mentioned earlier, makes that magnificent charge against the Round Forest. It's a very deadly charge. Joe Palmer's brigade makes a charge as well. And William Preston. Preston and Palmer basically make a joint charge towards Round Forest. It's the last one of the day. It was the largest charge of the day and the one with the least casualties because they saw there was no way they were going to succeed. So they quickly went to ground and took cover. And that kind of ended the fighting. But all that to say, as we get into January 1st, Bragg is rather appalled and surprised that Rosecrans hasn't left. He fully expected Rosecrans to retreat overnight. Clearly the Confederates had won this battle. He had sent what amounted to a congratulatory message back to Richmond. God is gracious, but a tremendous victory. We have 29 guns and X number of thousands of prisoners, and we have near all the field except on the extreme left where they held us, and that's the Round Forest and the Nashville Pike.
I think there's a lesson to be learned there. Never send a self-congratulatory note before the battle's actually over. That seems to have happened a few times.
It does tend to box Mr. Bragg in a little bit, is kind of the sequel will show. On January 1st, and apparently unbeknownst to Bragg and apparently unbeknownst to Breckinridge, Rosecrans dispatches Horatio Van Cleve's division, now under Sam Beatty. He dispatches them to cross Stones River at McFadden's Ford, and they take position on the rearward slopes of what I now call Beatty's Ridge, which is now part of a housing development. So good luck ever finding it. But they take cover on the back slope of this ridge. But Rosecrans is thinking offensively. He knows he has thousands of reinforcements in Nashville he can call forward if need be. And he's thinking he can still win this fight. And the intention was he had sent his wagons back to Nashville on January 1st. They were going to come back to the Army on January 3rd with a full load of ammunition, a few thousand more reinforcements. And he was basically going to go back to his battle plan of the 31st to basically stack up his forces on his left, cross Stones River, push Bragg out of Murfreesboro, and get athwart his railroad line and drive him to the south. So Rosecrans is thinking here in a few days, he's just going to hold out, get his supplies, get a few more reinforcements, and then he's going to launch his attack. That's why Beatty's division was here. Interestingly enough, Bragg doesn't know that they're there until about midday on January 2nd. Breckinridge claims he doesn't know they're there until midday on about the morning of January 2nd. But two of Breckinridge's staff officers in their accounts written right after the battle talk about discovering this Union force there on Thursday the 1st. What I don't understand is if they knew that these Federals were there on Thursday the 1st, why didn't they bother telling their commander, Breckinridge, that they were there?
Seems like it's something you'd want to bring up.
Something didn't go right here, or their memories are off. Hard to say. But either way, Beatty's division basically remains on the east side of Stones River undercover into January 2nd. When they are discovered that morning and about midday, Bragg realizes he has a number of problems going on. For starters, he knows he cannot keep his army at Murfreesboro for long. An army is an engine of consumption without equal. And the amount of foodstuffs and whatnot that were in the area with both armies in close proximity would be very rapidly depleted. Now, maybe the food for the men isn't so important, but you got to have forage and things for horses. And you got thousands of horses in this army. So if we're going to be here for long, he needed this engagement decided. The other problem that he kind of made a discovery on the morning of January 2nd. Now, the Confederate artillery isn't talked about very much in this battle because they don't really get into the fight. They don't have a chance. But on the morning of the 2nd, the Union Army, the two armies fought over the Round Forest area repeatedly throughout this battle. And on the morning of the 2nd, the Federals had reoccupied it after abandoning it the day before. Well, Bragg lined up a number of artillery batteries under the cloak of darkness within a few hundred yards of the Round Forest. And at dawn, they all lit up the forest, and then he charged with his troops and recaptured the ground. The lesson I think Bragg learned out of that was if I can concentrate my artillery, I can compel the Federals to move. So he starts surveying the ground, and his eyes fall upon Beatty's Ridge. Beatty's Ridge is 586 feet high. It is 30 feet higher than the ridge at McFadden's Ford. So it commands McFadden's Ford, commands McFadden's Ridge, and more importantly, that ground commands the left rear of the Federal Army. Mm-hmm. So Bragg sees this, remember, he is an artilleryman at heart. That's how he came up in the Army. And he's looking for an opportunity to get his guns into this fight somehow. And he has ample artillery. I think there are 5 batteries in park along Wilkinson Pike not doing a thing because they can't get through the cedars. So he's got ample guns he can put on a ridge. And if he's put those guns on commanding ground, maybe he can drive Rosecrans away from Stones River by making it so hot they'd have no choice but to retire. That was the thought process behind this. But once again, the timing is critical. He can't sit here for days because he knows Rosecrans has thousands of reinforcements that could come to Murfreesboro. He's got to win the fight with what he's got on hand, and he's got to win it quick. And this is a way that he sees to do that by putting these guns on this ridge, basically entrenching, and then, basically, laying in masses of fire into the Federal rear, which would take place on January 3rd. The second piece of that was he knew that if he got his guns up on that ridge and did it late enough in the day on January 2nd, Friday, January 2nd, the Union Army there was no way they were going to stage a night assault across Stones River against a ridge. No way in the world that was good. There's no way. They had tried something a little similar to this back on December 29th down at Harker's Crossing, and Harker's men were very lucky to get out with their lives. Yeah. It was quite a fight. But the thought was, we're going to seize this position at the very tail end of the day. It'll be basically the sun will be setting as we take this hill. We're going to spend all night moving batteries up there and reinforcements and entrenching it, such that when the Federals wake up the next morning, if they want to charge at us, go right ahead. I'm going to have like 30 cannon up here, 2 brigades of infantry behind breastworks. You're not pushing us off this ridge. And, oh, by the way, you're going to have to do that after crossing a river.
Right.
It's Fredericksburg all over again.
Mm-hmm.
That was what he was thinking. How it actually developed was it came as quite a shock when he found out that the Federals already had this ground. He was actually pretty upset about it, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Breckinridge, how in the world did you not know this was going on in your front? So that may explain why Breckinridge didn't know until the 2nd when his staff knew on the 1st.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, if the Union Army is now on the highest ground on the battlefield, if they start entrenching up there and they bring their batteries over, they would enfilade the rear of Polk's line along the Nashville Pike and at the Round Forest. And if Polk had to retire, Hardee would too, and pretty soon the whole Confederate position at Murfreesboro is in tatters.
Mm-hmm.
So he viewed this as an existential threat to the Army, that if we didn't recover this ground, we had to leave, which would mean defeat. And oh, by the way, I just told Richmond 2 days ago that we had won. So in a lot of ways, he's kind of he's got himself boxed in here.
All right.
So he elects to utilize Breckinridge's division to attack this ground, Beatty's Ridge, in part because Breckinridge's division was the closest at hand. Not for any personal animus, although I'm sure he was not, I think he'd have had his fill of problems with the Kentuckians.
Oh, I'm sure.
But he did not dispatch them into this attack as some bizarre method of discipline or anything else. It was
that's where they'd been.
They were the closest ones to this ground, and they were going to take part in the fight. And oh, by the way, Breckinridge's division had suffered the least amount of casualties of any of them at Stones, and all the Confederate divisions ultimately took very heavy casualties in this fight. None of them had walked out unscathed. But at this point, Breckinridge's division is in the best overall condition. They're on the closest ground. And so there's this famous conference, 12:30, 1 o'clock in the afternoon at Bragg's headquarters. Interestingly, the story that comes out later from Theodore O'Hara is that when Bragg gives these attack orders to Breckinridge protests them vociferously and swears that it's going to be the destruction of his division. Captain William Pickett, who was on General William J. Hardee's staff and who was at this conference, makes no such mention, and is quite clear that if Bragg had known, which he did not know, because he couldn't have known because it hadn't happened yet, but if Bragg had known that all these Union artillery batteries were going to be put in such a position that you couldn't hold that ridge, he never would have ordered the assault.
Right.
But
so with speaking of the protest with Breckinridge, there's the story about Roger Hansen saying, he's going to, what do you say? He's going to go.
Hansen, being something of a hothead.
Which, by the way, is the commander of the Orphan Brigade, right?
When he heard about this, he was going to go and kill Bragg.
Yeah.
I don't include that in my book because honestly, I don't believe it.
Yeah, I mean,
it's really kind of it's not consistent. It smacks to me of a post-mortem, something someone would say to make to cover up for what really happened.
Yeah,
which,
right.
We'll talk about here momentarily, but yeah, as far as Roger Hansen, he may very well have protested it, but so much of this attack is shrouded in what people said about it after the event to cover up for what really happened.
Mm-hmm.
And what really happened was, Breckinridge's mission was very clear and very defined. His job was to take Beatty's Ridge, plunk his men down, and hold the ground.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. His men accomplished that mission. And they accomplished it within 20 minutes of leaving Wayne's Hill. The problem that occurred was that in following a good military maxim, i.e. when the enemy's on the run, you keep after them, they kept chasing the Union Army and they walked themselves right into a killing field. and the division suffered 1,800 casualties in about half an hour.
Mm-hmm.
They overran their objective in their ardor to keep up the pressure on the Yankee army instead of following their orders and plunking down on that ridge like they should have.
You're right.
And that's the truth that nobody wants to talk about. And like I said, I do not blame the individual Kentucky soldier at all. There are no harder fighters in the Confederacy than these guys. But in this case, discretion probably would have been the better course. They should have followed their orders. Their commanders knew what their orders were. Although this attack was also laid on very quickly without a lot of preparation time. So it's possible maybe the colonels knew and the captains didn't understand, and the captains didn't know to restrain their men. We've got the Yankees on the run. Why are we going to tell these guys to hold back?
Right.
But they overrun the objective. And as they're doing so, John Mendenhall, chief of artillery for Crittenden's Corps, has been given permission to gather up whatever federal artillery he can lay his hands on and put them in position on McFadden's Heights and start laying fire on these Confederates that are surging towards the Union position, which he does very successfully. An interesting point, I want to kind of hammer this one home again. Beatty's Ridge is 586 feet high. The highest point on McFadden's Ridge is 554. So it's about a 30-foot difference between the two. Guns on Beatty's Ridge will command McFadden's Heights. And during the course of the about 20-minute artillery engagement that occurs on January 2nd, the Confederates managed to drive off 2 federal batteries off McFadden's Ridge. No one ever talks about that. Mm-hmm. Had Bragg's plan been followed, there within a very short amount of time, there would have been 18 Confederate guns atop Beatty's Ridge, and there would have been about 20 more by the morning. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's any way Rosecrans would have had the troops or the wherewithal to drive them off. And if they couldn't drive them off, they couldn't stay where they were at, and they would have had to leave.
Right.
The Confederates came within a hair's breadth of winning this battle, but they lost it. They lost it because they overran their objective. And they overran their objective for a good military reason. When the enemy's on the run, you keep after them. Mm-hmm. It worked until it didn't. And when it didn't, it was brutal and it was bloody.
Wow.
In your research, did you come across any reference whatsoever where Bragg, we've already talked about, Bragg is not punishing these Kentuckians willfully, but there's also the story about Bragg was upset because the Kentuckians never joined him in Kentucky, Breckinridge Division specifically.
I wouldn't be surprised that Bragg was wanting to hold a grudge. There was certainly some sour grapes there. I think he felt like he'd have been a little bit led down the primrose path by John Hunt Morgan and his overly optimistic appraisal of the 30,000 Kentuckians that are going to join us.
16th. 1862 telegram.
Yeah. And it just didn't happen. And the Kentuckians that did join, they joined the cavalry.
Right.
What did Bragg take into Kentucky with him? Like 20,000 rifles.
15,000
small arms.
Yeah.
He needed infantry. He didn't need, another 5,000 undisciplined cowboys riding around his army. But that's what he got. I mean, when you get down to how many troops did he actually raise in Kentucky? I've heard
2,500. It's 1/10. Yeah, it's 1/10 of the Morgan's.
A tenth of the estimate, and very few of them being infantrymen. So there was a bit of, you want us to come up here and defend your state, but when we do, you don't join us. So are you with us or not?
Bragg, though, knows that Breckinridge can't join him. It's not a Breckinridge issue.
No, as far as like Breckinridge's division, there was command issues going on between him and Van Dorn and Sterling Price, and Breckinridge during the summer of '62 is all the way down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Yeah,
that's a long way from Kentucky, and it took months of bickering back and forth. And it wasn't Breckinridge, whoever Breckinridge was reporting to at that time. By the time the Kentucky campaign's over, Breckinridge's men are basically in eastern Tennessee, moving into Kentucky when they can see Kentucky. So they never make it to Kentucky. But there was certainly an animus between Breckinridge and Bragg. certainly exacerbated by the Asa Lewis incident, but there was issues prior to that. But yeah, I can't agree with the argument that Bragg sent Breckinridge's division. You've heard the same argument that, Hood sent the Army into Franklin to punish them for not closing the gap at Spring Hill on the 29th of November.
You mean that's not true? But yeah, and I think it's a good point.
To me, it comes from the same place.
Mm-hmm.
The end result of both of these, I mean, Franklin was an even bloodier disaster than Breckinridge's attack. And who's responsible? Who's responsible for this? I mean, ultimately, Bragg ordered this attack. He's responsible for the outcome. He knows it.
Mm-hmm.
Breckinridge is responsible. It's his division. Breckinridge's officers are responsible for not, understanding the objective and allowing their men to overrun it. They didn't control their men.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, who's responsible? You can blame it on the company grade officers and the sergeants who, for whatever reason, let their men overrun their objective. Who's responsible for that? It's much easier to just blame. Oh, you just wanted to sacrifice the Kentuckians because you don't like them. No, this was a failure of control, reaching from the top of the Army right down to the company level. That we had a job to do. We accomplished it, but then we overdid it.
Right.
And that's on us. And the responsibility now is spread out across a much broader swath. And of course, we all have reputations to protect. And Bragg, we don't like him anyways. I'm convinced that Theodore O'Hara came up with this story about the protest and whatnot to help Breckinridge save face with the fact that a assault that he directed cost about 500 Kentuckians in about a half hour. And it was an attempt to, shall we say, politically shield him from the damage that was done. And O'Hara himself has a very checkered history with Bragg and was himself booted out of the Army not very long afterwards at Joe Johnston's direction, not at Bragg's. Because he had a habit of taking lies and half-truths and feeding them to the Mobile newspapers and using them to destroy Breckinridge's opponents, whoever they might be. In this case, it was Bragg. This false story that comes out about, well, none of the generals counseled Bragg about retreating on January 3rd. That was his own idea. That's another O'Hara lie. Mm-hmm. So, unfortunately, his fingers are all over this story, which makes it hard to what really happened and how much of this is O'Hara's spin.
And I think a good counterpoint to the whole, Bragg sending these guys in just because he dislikes them. A couple of weeks before was the Battle of Hartsville, where there are 2 Kentucky infantry regiments out of the Orphan Brigade that are attached with
6
a few Morgans. Yeah, and
they fought magnificently.
He lavishes them with praise.
Oh yeah,
and how proud he
Morgan
is.
Morgan gets a star out of the deal.
Yeah, so I have a hard time thinking.
At Bragg's recommendation.
Right.
So yeah, the whole story it doesn't add up. It doesn't add up probably because it's not true.
Right.
And it like I said, Bragg is ultimately responsible for directing this attack, but he made the attack feeling that if he did not, his army had no choice but to retreat from Murfreesboro. So It was a bit of a desperation move. No doubt about it.
If it succeeds, it's brilliant. If it fails, then
you're
an idiot.
My what if scenario is, okay, and it wasn't just the Orphan Brigade. William Preston's brigade was there. Daryl, one of your favorite brigadiers of the Civil War, Gideon Pillow, was the major Confederate reinforcement that arrived on January 2nd. One of the most incompetent puppies to ever put a gray uniform on. He bumps Joseph Palmer out of brigade command, takes Palmer's brigade into action, and is found hiding behind a tree, not providing leadership at all. He's saving his worthless hide. And pardon me for getting worked up because this guy just hurts me to no end.
He is scouting behind cover. I mean,
Yeah.
let's
be generous, but
and
not providing
had this
the
conversation.
leadership that
He's not.
Palmer's brigade certainly deserved, and that Joseph
He is
Palmer, by the way, a Murfreesboro native, was fully capable of providing.
Yeah.
But that was not Breckenridge's idea. It wasn't even really Bragg's. It was Pillow showed up, and Bragg felt he had to do something with him, and I put him in command of one of these brigades making the assault. I
could have sent him back to Fort Donelson to actually stand there for a surrender.
The 83rd Illinois was there then. He wouldn't have got in the gate.
Well, no, he could have surrendered properly. Actually surrendered.
But yeah, as I said, Adams Brigade also takes part in this assault. So it's not just the Orphan Brigade. The Orphan Brigade's in the front line, and they take very heavy casualties. But Adams Brigade takes a walloping too. So does Preston. So does Pillow/Palmer's Brigade. I mean, all four of these brigades, I think, fought. They fought hard. They fought well. The key point was you overran your objective and you walked into this. Essentially, it was the river bottoms. And the culminating moment was as they have driven Beatty's brigade off, or Beatty's two brigades off this ridge and have the Federals on the run and they're pursuing them, the Federal artillery on McFadden's Heights and beyond start opening fire. And John Franklin Miller is seeing this going on. He has two brigades from Negley's division up on McFadden's Heights. They see these Confederates surging towards their position, and they're thinking, "Holy God, this is like the right wing all over again. This is the beginning of the battle all over again. We got the Union Army on the run." And he decides that the only way that, he sees the Confederates starting to take casualties, but he's afraid it's not going to be enough. He decides to countercharge across the river with his brigade. He talks Timothy Stanley into doing it. And the problem was Union command and control in this particular portion of the battle at this time really seemed to fall apart. Miller reports to Negley. Negley can't be found. Thomas can't be found. Rosecrans can't be found. The only commander that anyone can find is John Palmer, who commands a division in the left wing, not the center. So they're not quite in the right, not going up the right chain of command. And Palmer doesn't know, basically tells him not to cross. Don't do this counterattack. I have no orders to do that. And Miller looks at it and goes, "You know what? I ultimately don't report to you, and I'm the commander on the ground, and I see that if I don't do this, we're going to lose this position, probably lose the battle." That was how he viewed it. And he decides, and like I said, he talks in Timothy Stanley into charging with his brigade as well. These two brigades charge across Stones River, kind of at the apex of this Confederate attack. The Confederates collapse very quickly. And Miller's and Stanley's men charge all the way. They recover Beatty's Ridge. They actually capture Wright's Tennessee battery atop the ridge. They capture the colors of the 26th Tennessee, which is part of Pillow's brigade. And essentially end the battle on a very high note for the Union Army. They were basically, by the end of the evening, January 2nd, both armies are exactly where they were 12 hours earlier. Mm-hmm. There's been all this carnage and nothing has changed. And that kind of sets the narrative for how Stones River is viewed. Enormous carnage that changed nothing.
Right.
Which I don't think that's accurate, but that is essentially how it has come down to us in history. It's just this horrifically bloody battle that didn't mean a hill of beans. Right. That, at the end of the day, we moved the Confederates about 30 miles, maybe about 20 miles further south from where they were. That's quite a price to pay for that little bit of ground.
Right.
But its meaning was far greater than that.
Oh, for sure. Well, I think this is a perfect spot to stop part 2 here. And for all you listeners, I highly encourage you to stick around for part 3, which will be coming out soon. If you didn't get a chance to listen to part 1, definitely go back and listen to that. Also, I think it would be beneficial to get ready for part 3, have a map available of Stones River. And just so you can kind of follow along a little better and see where all these places are on a map. I think that'll definitely help you. So, Dan, thank you so much for coming on, and we are very much looking forward to part 3, where we can talk about even more of the drama and the stories that we haven't even been able to scratch the surface on yet.
Outstanding.